infrastructure. What do you think that might mean for how you look at the settings?
Yeah, so obviously I made changes last budget to the way we think about our debt profile in New Zealand, and to move away from the percentage debt target that we'd set ourselves and previous governments had set, to more towards a debt ceiling approach. Part of that was to deal with the unexpected in terms of weather and emergencies, and we're having to do that now. And some of it was also about taking a longer term view about how we do fund our infrastructure, for an example. So I'll have more to say about that in the coming months. As to exactly how we do that. It's important to note that the level of infrastructure deficit New Zealand has, you'll never solve that in one budget, or indeed even in one particular plan. But I think given the climate change challenges that New Zealand's facing, the deficit that we've got, the immediate crises, there is a strong case for us looking at the way we use our balance sheet in terms of investing in infrastructure.
Do you think that 30% ceiling is appropriate when the climate's changing so fast?
Look, I think that's the change we made, and I think it's the one I'll be sticking to, but I do understand the point you're making, that the level of adaptation, the level of change that's required is significant. It's not just the government. So everybody's got a role to play in this. Local government does, the private sector, all those who develop. But I'm confident that the balance that we'll strike will be the right one, and it certainly gives us a lot more headroom than we used to have. I'm not forcing you to leap it, only if you want to.
What are you going to change going forward? That wasn't the case. I guess a lot of people were frustrated at the lack of, action on infrastructure investment that happened, even though there was a lot of earmarked. What's going to change?
Yeah, look, we've been playing a lot of catch up. That's the truth. I'm thinking about rail in New Zealand. We've put, I think we're over $6 billion extra into rail over the last few years, and all that did was largely bring some of that infrastructure back up to where it should have been. So I can't go back and recreate history. All I can do is say, yep, we're going to do that. What I think would be different here is much more of a longer term plan, and I guess a greater level of ambition about what that infrastructure looks like, that it genuinely is climate resilient. Now, we're going to face some of these decisions very, very soon, because when we think about what happens to the roads in the Coromandel or the East Coast or the rail network even in that area, we have to think about rebuilding that not in a way that just gets it open again, but actually makes it resilient for the future. That then raises the question about whether it's the right road and the right place. And the communities who are served by that need to be part of those discussions and how we work through from there. So the difference will be clearer and better long-term planning that is about the long-term resilience.
Do you think they'll need to take in more money in taxes?
Funding is a really interesting part of this, because we already have a review underway of the National Land Transport Fund. Now, the National Land Transport Fund is the result of all of the petrol taxes and road user charges that people pay. It was already under challenge because as we moved to decarbonise our transport fleet, we cut off the funding source, and so we were already looking at how we could do that. So yes, it will ask questions about what is the mix of sources of funding, where do we get that from? I'm not going to put my penny down today on exactly what those are, but clearly we do that. One element is the balance sheet we already have. The other is what revenue we take in, and that's the question we have to ask.
So the government's tried to keep their tax take as a percentage of GDP towards 30, maybe under 30. Can you really have a government of that size when you're dealing with not just climate change, but population growth and trying to fix it?
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. I guess there I look at the balance of the capital spending we've got to do and the operating spending we've got to do, how we get the balance of that right. The economy grows, so therefore there is more money available in the forecast. The economy grows, so there is more money available even though the percentage stays similar. I'm comfortable that we can put a budget together that balances the sort of long-term fiscal sustainability of that, the need that we've got, and the growth that we see in the economy. But they are conversations we will have to have over many years.
So you're comfortable with the 30 rule?
We haven't changed. It's not a rule. And of course we're well above 30 in terms of expenditure because of the response to COVID.
But you're on a track down.
That's right, and as I said, that's because I think that gives us some sustainability. But we have to measure these things in the here and now, and so all of that is what we're discussing in the budget. But I wouldn't call it a rule. Is what I'm sorry.
In the Infrastructure Commission's report, they said $100 billion deficit now, going to build their way out of it, be another 100 billion. So they have to do some demand management.
Yeah.
But no politician seems to want to do congestion.
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I mean, actually, we had a select committee inquiry where all parties backed the concept of congestion charging. And so you'll see in the government's response to the infrastructure strategy, we've said, yep, that's one of the things that we've got to look at, whether or not, where that would come in. This does bear on a question.
You put it in your manifesto?
We haven't put our manifesto out yet. We did have in our manifesto that we'd investigate it. So, we're in that process now.
3 seconds later, you'll get, let's cut it.
But, well, this is the interesting thing, though, is that all of this becomes a partnership, doesn't it? Because local government's critical to that. In the city that I live in Wellington, as we're making decisions about a big transport and urban infrastructure program there, we're having to work with the councils to say, well, how will you fund your portion of this? And so here in Auckland, we have the regional fuel tax. We can and have in the past shown our ability to be flexible about that. But, you're right, these are challenges. We can't, as the Infrastructure Commission said, just build our way out. So we do have to look at other ways of managing that. But I do think it does point to the need for some of the major reforms like Three Waters. And when I look at what's happening in Gisborne right now, that council and those councils there would be severely challenged to be able to recover from this on their own. And so those sorts of reforms are the other part of the infrastructure picture. It's not just the money that we need to put in, it's also the structures we build around it.
So would you ask the opposition to come up with some sort of bipartisan deal? Because that seems to always be the issue.
Yeah.
No one wants to commit long term, and if you can't plan long term, we don't.
Yeah, and I think the goal in big long-term things like infrastructure should be as much shared agenda as we can possibly get, and that's why the strategy is important. The pipeline that the Commission is creating is important. I don't think you'll ever remove different governments having the odd project that they have more emphasis on than another one. But if the opposition were prepared to buy into the climate elements of the infrastructure strategy, that would be a really good start. So I think it's possible, but in the end, we've just got to get on with this and work across society to make it happen.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
In terms of temporary accommodation, how open is the checkbook at this point?
Well, certainly the temporary accommodation service, particularly here in Auckland, is operating, and I saw some numbers the other day about 700 odd families that were being worked with by the temporary accommodation service. It's one of those things where we do what we have to do. Shelter is the most basic need, and we certainly, in all the crises that I've been working through in the last few years, the temporary accommodation service funding's not always the issue. Sometimes it's literally the availability of housing. We've used a lot of temporary housing in other crisis areas, and I'm sure TAS will be doing that now.
Will there be funding for the likes of moving people around the country?
Yeah, that has happened in the past at times. It'll be a little bit about whether that need is there and where the spaces are, but certainly that has been done in the past.
What are you going to?
Immigration, and saying there were questions about
Yeah.
what exactly is being done to make that faster? Because that's been the problem for many years.
Oh, look, we've worked, just to take that part of your question, we've worked very closely, particularly with the horticulture sector, on expanding the number of, for example, RSE workers who've come into the country. So we have done that. Clearly in COVID, there have been enormous challenges in every sector in that regard. What I was being asked about in there, though, was about what we do in the recovery and the rebuild. And we do have lessons from the past we can draw on here. We've created temporary visa classes in the past to support the rebuild of Christchurch. And so I know that Michael Wood, as the Minister of Immigration, is already talking to officials from MB about what immigration settings could change to help with that recovery and rebuild.
Have we clamped down too much on immigration, though, that has not allowed us to future fit for these bigger
No, I don't believe so. I mean, obviously COVID has been a very particular set of circumstances, but the immigration reset that we've got coming out of COVID has created a new system. It's a better system in terms of being an accredited employer, being able to go through a much quicker and swifter process. We've got the green list that is part of that is facilitating that in a number of sectors. We've got industry agreements in some sectors where they're able not to have to fulfil some of the changes around wage rates and so on. So I think we've been extremely flexible when it's come to how we're implementing that scheme. Context matters here, though. And the context here is a global labour market that is extremely tight. Every conversation I have with finance ministers around the world has this as an element in it. We've had some conversations with insurers. We know that some of them are bringing labour force over from Australia to help out with the rebuild. Those sorts of things will be a part of this picture, but it is in a very tight global context.
So how are you going to make New Zealand's offering more appealing for the most in-demand professions that you're going to need for this rebuild, around the world and the global?
I mean, it's important to not take this out of a historical context. New Zealand's wage rates, if we go back to the 50s, maybe we were at the same level as some of those other countries. But we're a small country beside a large country, and you can see everywhere in the world the impact that has. New Zealand is a great place to live. When people migrate to New Zealand, their experiences, by and large, are very, very positive. And so we have to promote the full lifestyle that we have in New Zealand. Our wages are competitive and getting more competitive in some sectors, but it has to be a full package about the world, the society that people want to live in and the kind of lifestyle they want.
But Immigration New Zealand and Tourism New Zealand also haven't been making that case for a number of years, right? Because of the pandemic and things. So.
And it is, and funnily enough, I was just saying to one of the people inside there that we've been talking with NZT and Tourism New Zealand about making sure that, even in the wake of these terrible tragedies in parts of New Zealand, there is still good lives to be had in our country, and it's really important we don't lose that perspective.
Just on the insurance, could you talk a bit more about what the government could do
Yep.
or is thinking about doing around people who are uninsured?
Yeah, it's extremely challenging, if you're a homeowner, it's unlikely you have no insurance, but there are some people who have, and for various reasons, ended up in the middle there. That's a specific category of people we have to think about. Then we have people who are uninsured for their contents, and there are a lot of those people in our rental market, and here in Auckland a number of those people have been affected. We can support those people in short-term ways, as we do through the social development system, and we have been doing that. When it comes to small businesses, I've been talking with Simon Bridges about this. Unfortunately, in the wake of COVID, a number of small businesses did let insurance go. It was just one cost more that they didn't want. We've been working with the Chamber around how they can support those businesses through advice and so on. And some of the funding, I'm sure, that we've provided to the Chamber and the EMA may well go to supporting some of those businesses to get on their feet. I do think there's a bigger picture question, and you raised the question before about spending and government revenue and the climate world. Insurance and the climate world is another really big topic. And this is something I think as a government we will, in the long term, medium and long term, be having to think about what that looks like. For now, I'm grateful to the cooperation of the insurance industry as to where we are, but there are some big picture questions to answer, which sadly we don't have time to get into too much today.
But just on the issue of moral hazard, if the government's going to bail out the people who
Aren't
didn't
insured.
pay for the insurance, why should I pay for my insurance?
And that is exactly the point I made in there. And so therefore, we have to be very careful about stepping our way through that. We want to make sure that the insurance industry, the banking industry, ourselves all work together with those people as to how they get through this, but there is a moral hazard there, absolutely.
Just finally on the
I'll just take
local
a couple
government, central government split 60-40, you suggested in there that maybe the government could help if the councils couldn't find their 40%.
I was just making the point that I think for some of those councils the 40% will be very tough to find. There are a number of ways of thinking about that. One role would be that central government paid more. Another is the LGFA playing a role in supporting those councils depending on where their debt levels currently are. The point I was really making was these, particularly Gisborne District, is a small rating base and they will find it hard. So we'll have to sit down and talk that through with them. I don't have a resolution. So I'll just take these two. Yep.
I was listening in the conference there when you said
Good.
it's quite early on to estimate cost. But can I get you to weigh in on, are you expecting the cost of this rebuild to be greater than the kind of 40-odd billion for the Christchurch rebuild?
It genuinely is very, very hard to tell where we are right now. I think it's a regional and multi-regional event. It will be in the billions of dollars, absolutely, but it's just so difficult to say the extent of it at this point. So, I'm not going to put that number on it just because I don't know, but I recognise that there's a number, when you say 40 billion, that's It's more than actually the number I've got in my head for the Canterbury earthquake sequence, but that's everything. That's not just central government costs, that's insurance costs, that's local government costs, that's businesses' own costs and households. So this will be a significant event financially for the government and for individuals, households, businesses, banks and insurers. The scale of it, we just don't know. I'll just take Talipa.
Is there room for you to shift tax thresholds, and if you have to, we have to make up that money somewhere else?
Look, we're still in the process of both setting the budget and also setting our tax policy for the election. We haven't done that yet, so I'm not answering you because I don't want to. It's just because we haven't made those decisions yet. What I would say is the point that I made in there earlier today, that in the wake of the need to respond to this cyclone and the events that we've got with the fiscal track that we've been on, we're going to have to think very carefully about what spending that we do, and tax cuts are part of a spending or a revenue package. And so any government, any want-to-be government, would have to be thinking very seriously about the balance of that over the next few months.
Would it be irresponsible for a government to cut taxes when you've got an inflation issue and you are going to have to draw on the balance sheet to deal with it?
What I think a responsible government needs to do is say exactly how things add up and exactly what the impacts will be on inflation.